Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Ghost and the Witch's Coven by Bobby Holmes, also known as Anna J. McIntyre, narrated by Romy Nordlinger. 1. Scotland, 1618. Calloused bare feet carried Blair Tolmach across the wet field, away from the lush woodland with its abundance of oak, downy birch, wych elm, holly, hazel, and other treasures of nature her mother Gavinia taught her to respect, many of which provided valuable ingredients for Gavinia's magical potions. Having completed her morning chores, the young girl raced home. The hem of her long, tattered wool skirt flapped along her ankles, yet she managed to avoid tripping. Overhead, the Scottish mist grayed the afternoon sky. To her right, she glimpsed the sheep of her neighbors lazily grazing, yet her focus remained on the humble cottage in the distance she shared with her mother. Careful not to drop the basket she carried and risk spilling the herbs she had spent the morning collecting in the woodland, Blair clutched tightly to the basket's handle. Those in the village called women like her mother a wise woman, a cunning woman, or a witch. Gavinia called herself midwife and healer. While respected among her neighbors, Gavinia had impressed upon her daughter caution in representing her powers or intent. When a local healer ran afoul of her neighbors, they might accuse her of witchcraft. An accusation alone could mean torture and death. When Blair was old enough to understand the danger her mother faced by helping others, she wished her mother had not been born with her gifts. Yet she also understood those special gifts made Gavinia the woman she was, and Blair dearly loved her mother. She had also loved her father, Gavinia's late husband, who died from the fever the previous winter. Even his wife's potions could not save him. Blair sorely missed her father. A fisherman, she remembered him as being tall and sturdy as an oak, with flaming red hair. He had loved to sing and carve magical animals from the whalebones he brought home with him from his fishing trips. Her mother wore one around her neck, a hawk, a white hawk, fastened to a thin leather cord. But her father would no longer be carving from whalebones, singing songs, or sharing their cottage. Just weeks after his death, their landlord Laird Douglas Blackwood informed her mother that she no longer needed to pay rent for the cottage. Instead, she could move into Blackwood Hall and work in his kitchen. Gavinia possessed many talents and attributes. Not only was she considered one of the fairest women in the village and a talented healer, she was also known as an exceptional cook. When Blair asked her mother why she turned down the laird's offer, Gavinia muttered, "'Tis not my cooking he wants, lassie." Whatever the reason for declining the proposal, it relieved Blair. Both the laird and his wife terrified the young girl. Just last spring, the wife had accused a local beggar woman of witchcraft, resulting in the woman's death. Blair did not know if the beggar had been a witch or not, but she heard that while they tortured the woman for a confession, she had died before giving one, and before accusing others. According to some local villagers, they believed a witch's spell had killed the beggar woman, placed on her by someone who did not want to face the same accusation. When Blair reached her cottage a few minutes later, she spied a horse tied up along the front rail. She recognized the animal immediately. It belonged to Laird Blackwood. She had never seen him at her cottage before and wondered why he was here. Glancing from the horse to the open kitchen window, she spied the laird standing inside with her mother. Not wanting to make her presence known, she crept up to the house and crouched below the window, still holding on to the basket. She listened. "Laird, I tell ye, I cannot be accepting your generous offer," Blair heard her mother say. "It's nae an offer, it's an order. You will move up to your fresh quarters by nightfall to the morrow. There will be duties expected of your daughter, of course. I notice she's grown up to be a fair bonny lassie." "My laird, and if I refuse?" Gavinia's trembling voice asked. Terrified, Blair continued to listen. The laird expected her mother and her to move up to Blackwood Hall by nightfall tomorrow. He had even promised their cottage to someone else. When her mother asked what would happen if she refused, he called her a willful woman, and then pointed out it was a sure sign of one consorting with the devil. Blackwood questioned what evil practices Gavinia had taught Blair. The frightened child listened as her mother's resolve vanished, and she heard Gavinia agree to move up to Blackwood Hall. Tears slid down Blair's face as she continued to huddle under the window. Although tender in years, Blair understood Blackwood's implied threat against her had ultimately swayed her mother. She knew children were not safe from the accusation of witchcraft and could face torture and execution, as did an adult. A moment later she heard the slamming of the cottage door, and several minutes later the sound of hoofs trotted down the road, presumably carrying Laird Blackwood to his next destination. Instead of standing up and going into the cottage, Blair remained frozen to the spot on the damp ground. She expected to hear her mother crying, but instead she heard the slamming of pots and pans, as if someone was tearing apart the kitchen. Hesitantly, she stood up and looked into the cottage. She watched as her mother hurried around in the room, gathering up items and setting them on the kitchen table. Still clutching her basket, Blair turned and headed for the cottage entrance. "We're going away, lassie," Gavinia said breathlessly the moment Blair walked into the kitchen, basket in hand. "I heard, Mama," Blair whispered. "I was outdoors by the window. I heard what Laird Blackwood said." Gavinia stopped dashing around the kitchen and studied her daughter a moment. Silently, she took the basket from Blair's grasp, set it on the table, and drew the girl into her arms for a comforting hug. "We're off to my cousin's," Gavinia whispered. "It's a long journey, but we will be safe there. We'll travel through the woodland. We must lean out, he be fair afore he kens we ha' gone." Blair felt relief knowing they were not moving to Blackwood Hall, but she also understood the dangers of fleeing. Yet she trusted her mother and understood Gavinia felt safer going through the woodland, a vast wilderness she knew well, and a place they could easily lose themselves in while surviving off the land as they traveled to her mother's cousin for refuge. Gavinia told her daughter what they needed to take, knowing it would limit them on what they carried. Since they owned only one horse, they would ride double or take turns riding. Gavinia wanted to get as far away from Lord Blackwood as soon as possible. Riding double and carrying less while traveling such a distance seemed the most reasonable plan. "It's probably fare the best," Gavinia said when Blair expressed sadness at having to leave so much behind. "Should Laird Blackwood come by the morrow after we've gane and see our belongings stacked, as if we intend to take them to Blackwood Lobby the morrow fortnight, you won't suspect we ha' gane." Gavinia released hold of her daughter, and the two began gathering up what they planned to take, while stacking all they intended to leave by the door. They were almost finished when a young boy named Jamie pounded on the cottage door. "It's Mama!" Jamie shouted when Gavinia opened the door. She knew immediately why the young boy wanted her. His mother was expecting a baby, yet it wasn't due for several more weeks. "You hate to come?" Gavinia and Blair exchanged worried glances before Gavinia looked down at the boy and told him to hurry back to his mama and that she would be there shortly. She left him standing on the front porch and closed the door behind her as she turned and faced Blair. Knowing her mother would never abandon a woman in need, Blair asked what they were going to do now. Gavinia assured her daughter they would leave as soon as she finished with the woman. They would meet at their secret place and be far from Laird Blackwood before he discovered they had gone. She went on to tell Blair what she needed to gather for their escape. Gavinia started to turn away from her daughter, yet paused a moment and removed the leather cord with a white hawk carving from her neck. She turned to her daughter and carefully secured the necklace on the young girl. "With this, ken your papa is keeking o'er ya till I come to ya," Gavinia whispered to her daughter before kissing her forehead. "I love ya, bairn." Reverently, Blair reached up, her fingertips brushing the delicate carving. She looked back to her mamma and whispered, "Hurry, Mama, I love ya." When Gavinia opened the door a few minutes later, it surprised her to find Jamie still lingering on the front porch. Leaving her young daughter behind to prepare for their escape and wait in the nearby woodlands, Gavinia hurriedly followed the boy. They reached his home within 20 minutes. Waiting outside was the boy's anxious father and 10 siblings. They ranged from ages 2 to 16. The husband stayed outside with his children, while Gavinia rushed in the cottage to her patient. The moment she found the woman in bed burning with a fever, she knew something was drastically wrong. Within minutes of Gavinia's arrival, the baby came, yet it was stillborn. Minutes after the delivery, the weary and delirious woman looked up into Gavinia's eyes and moved her lips to say something. Yet before she uttered any words, her eyes closed, and her spirit drifted away, leaving the children outside motherless. Moments after Gavinia left the family to grieve, Jamie informed his father what he had overheard outside the Tolmach cottage while waiting for the midwife. After hearing his son's story, the man was convinced Gavinia was a witch and had just murdered his wife and daughter. He immediately went to Laird Blackwood and repeated the tale. He knew Laird Blackwood would do something. Hadn't that witch told her daughter she intended to flee from the laird? The laird's men captured Gavinia before she ever entered the woodland. She might have escaped had she not first stopped along a desolate section of road to weep for the dead woman and her stillborn child. Blair waited for her mother, and when she didn't come, she began to worry. After nightfall, she left her belongings and horse at the secret spot in the woodland and made her way to the village. Blair escaped the laird, yet primarily because he focused his attention on punishing the woman who intended to run away from him. Had he considered the additional pain he could inflict on Gavinia by searching for and bringing in the 10-year-old girl with a charge of witchcraft, he would not have done so. Truth be told, Blackwood was a little in love with the fair Gavinia, and while that might not prevent him from persecuting her for witchcraft, it kept him from charging the daughter. The details of her mother's incarceration, torture, trial, and eventual execution were for a week or more kept from Blair, although she did witness the ultimate conclusion of her mother's witch trial when they burned her at the stake in front of the entire village. 2. 400 years later. Late Tuesday evening, the last day of July, Walt pressed send on his computer's email program and marveled that his manuscript would reach his agent's computer within minutes. In his first lifetime, an author or the author's secretary would need to type a copy of the manuscript on paper. Copy machines had not yet been invented, and mail it through the postal service, which could take days or weeks to reach its destination. Celebrations were in order, yet it was too late for champagne. Danielle was already in the shower, getting ready for bed, and when she was done, it was his turn. Walt stood up from his desk, stretched, and went to turn down the bed before taking his shower. The next morning, the couple decided on a low-key celebration for Walt's second submission to his editor. They walked down to Pier Cafe for breakfast. When they returned home, they each grabbed a book and headed to the back patio to read. Clouds dotted the sky, and the afternoon temperatures hovered in the mid-60s. When they heard the mailman arrive, they both went inside. Walt settled on the sofa with his book while Danielle went to retrieve the day's mail. When she joined Walt in the living room several minutes later, she had already unwrapped a package that had arrived in the mail and carried it proudly, tilting it from side to side to get Walt's attention. He looked up from his book and silently watched Danielle break into a lively jig. In her hand she carried a broom. Not a typical broom one might buy at the hardware store, but one that looked homespun. Its handle appeared to have been cut directly from one of a tree's smaller branches and polished before attaching a bundle of twigs to one end. "What is that?" Walt asked, closing his book and setting it on his lap. "Isn't it obvious? It's a broom." "Yes, I see that. But what are you doing with it? Certainly you don't intend to have Joanne use that thing." Danielle laughed. "Of course not, silly." She held the broom out for him to inspect and asked, "What does it make you think of?" Walt shrugged. "A broom?" Danielle rolled her eyes. "A witch. It looks like a witch's broom." She moved the broom to her backside and pretended to sit on it while grinning at Walt. "You're planning to join that local witches' coven?" Walt teased. Danielle groaned dramatically and stood up straighter, now holding the broom by her side. "I'm talking about Halloween." "Halloween? Well, that's 3 months away. You're already working on your costume?" Walt asked. Danielle rolled her eyes again. "The broom isn't for me." "Well, I'm not dressing up like a witch. And stop rolling your eyes." "It's for the haunted house. I saw it online. It was on sale, and I figured not too early to plan for the haunted house and collect some new decorations." "Whoa. Who said anything about doing another haunted house this year? I thought we decided not to do another one," Walt asked. Danielle looked down at the broom and shrugged. "I thought we just hadn't made a commitment to do another one again. I don't recall us saying we absolutely wouldn't do a haunted house this Halloween." "I don't know why you would want to, considering all the trouble we had last year." Danielle let out a sigh. "There were fun moments." She looked at the broom again. "Doesn't this thing make you think of witches and Halloween?" She looked up to Walt and asked, "Do you know why they say witches flew brooms?" "Because they couldn't afford a car?" Ignoring Walt's answer, she held up the broom and said, "From what I read, witches used a broom something like this, but smaller, called a besom. I think they used it to brush away evil spirits or something." "And what does that have to do with flying?" Walt asked. "One article I read said they rubbed oil on the broom to make it fly." "You could always ask Heather. Maybe one of her oils will work," Walt snorted. "I don't think Heather has those kinds of oils," Danielle said with mock disappointment. "But it's too bad. I'd love to take this thing for a spin." Walt chuckled. "I think you need to do a little more research on witches and broom flying. The oil they rubbed on the broom had nothing to do with making a broom actually fly. Reportedly, whatever they rubbed on the brooms were hallucinogens." Danielle frowned. "Heather definitely doesn't have those types of oils. Are you telling me they were tripping out and just thought they were flying?" Walt shrugged. "Well, so some believe. The purpose of the broom applying the oils." Danielle wrinkled her nose. "I need to Google this again." "Well, if you really want to fly on that thing, I know one way you can do it, and it won't require taking any drugs." Danielle perked up. "Really?" "Sure. Wanna take a little spin around the living room?" She answered with a grin. Wearing denims, Danielle easily straddled the broom, holding onto the stick as a witch might actually do when flying through the night sky. "Get ready," Walt called out. The next minute the broom took flight, with Danielle on board, holding on for her life. Of course, had she thought about it, she would have realized Walt's telekinesis moved both her and the broom through the air, and even if she had not been holding on, she would not have fallen to the floor, not unless Walt lost concentration. Danielle laughed in delight as she circled the living room overhead and looked down at Walt, who sat on the sofa looking up at her. Movement from the door caught her attention, and she spied her cat, Max, strolling into the room. "Hey, Max," Danielle called out. Max looked up toward the ceiling and froze when he saw Danielle flying overhead. He sat down, let out a meow, and continued to watch, his black tail twitching back and forth. Officer Brian Henderson had not seen his cousin Kitty for over 5 years, and that had been at the funeral of her husband Tim. Brian had always liked Tim. Unfortunately, Kitty couldn't say the same about Brian's last 2 wives. As children, he and Kitty had been especially close. She was his favorite cousin, and he was hers. In those days, she was a tomboy and hadn't been afraid to give him a punch if she felt he needed it. After they had grown into adults, she had given him one of those punches when he had announced his engagement to his first wife. He should have paid more attention to that punch. She had liked his second wife more than his first. That was until she left him 6 months after their 25th wedding anniversary. Kitty had been supportive during that time, calling frequently and inviting him to visit her and Tim. But then Tim had died, and Kitty had her own life and sorrow to handle. Unlike Brian, she had adult children and grandchildren that helped fill the void. She eventually began traveling with one of her daughters, and she and Brian kept in touch with infrequent phone calls and frequent postcards. But Kitty was finally coming for a visit, and he had taken off some time to spend with her. Brian left work early on Wednesday. He planned to run some errands before his cousin arrived later that evening. On his way out of the police station, the chief stopped him and asked if he would mind stopping by Marlow House to give Danielle and Walt a message. He would do it himself, but he had a meeting in a few minutes, and he thought this message should be delivered in person. Brian agreed. After parking in front of Marlow House, Brian got out of his car and slammed the door closed behind him. He headed up the front walk. Just as he started through the front gate, motion from the living room window caught his eyes. He looked that way and froze. He couldn't be seeing what he was seeing, Brian told himself. It looked like Danielle, and she was flying around the living room, on a broomstick. He stood and stared in the window, his right hand resting on the front gate, preparing to open it so he could continue to the front door. Brian had to admit, she looked like she was having one hell of a good time. Was it a jetpack? It had to be a jetpack, he told himself. People didn't really fly around on broomsticks. Maybe witches did, if there really were witches, but there was no such thing as witches, right? Just like there were no such things as ghosts. A moment later, Danielle's flight ended, and the broom, with her on it, drifted to the floor. It was then he noticed Walt, who had been sitting on the sofa, but now stood. Brian watched as Danielle tossed the broom aside and then ran to her husband, throwing herself into his open arms for a hug. Brian shook his head in disbelief and muttered, "Just another day at Marlow House." "Brian, hello," Danielle greeted in surprise when she opened the front door 5 minutes later. "Hello, Danielle. The chief wanted me to stop and tell you and Walt something, but first I need to ask, was it some sort of jetpack?" Holding the door open, Danielle stared at Brian for a moment and then laughed nervously and said, "Oh, the flying broom? You saw that? That's just a little magic trick Walt was working on." "Walt is still interested in magic?" Brian asked. "Yeah, he likes to dabble." "I'd sure like to see how he did that one," Brian said. Danielle opened the door wider. "Come on in. No reason to keep you standing on the porch. You can wait in the parlor, and I'll go get Walt. You said you had something to tell both of us, right? A few minutes later, after situating Brian in the parlor, Danielle rushed to get Walt from the living room. "That was Brian Henderson at the door," Danielle said in a low voice when she reached the living room sofa where Walt had returned to his book. "He wants to talk to us about something." "Why didn't you bring him in here?" Walt asked. "Because I needed to give you a heads up. He saw my spin around the room, and if he asks about it, tell him it's one of your magic tricks. And if he asks how you did it, you need to tell him you can't give away your secrets." "Or I could tell him how I really did it. I'm sure he'd believe that," Walt snorted. "Why didn't we close the blinds first?" Danielle groaned. Walt closed his book, tossed it on the coffee table, and stood up. "Don't worry, love. I don't think Brian can arrest you for flying around your own living room without a license." Danielle gave Walt's arm a playful swat and said, "Oh, shut up." She then paused a moment and cocked her head as if considering something. "What is it?" Walt asked. "You know what is kind of weird? He didn't seem too freaked out about it. When Pearl saw Connor flying around the living room, she fainted in our bushes." "Well, I'm rather glad Brian didn't faint on the front walk. He could have hit his head and gotten a concussion." "Walt, take this seriously." "I am. A concussion is a serious thing." Danielle smiled. "What am I going to do with you?" Walt grinned. "I have a couple of ideas, but first we need to see what Brian wants and get him out of here." Danielle shook her head at Walt, reached up and gave him a quick kiss, and then started with him to the door. Just before they stepped out into the hallway, Danielle turned abruptly and ran back into the living room. She grabbed the broom and shoved it under the sofa cushions. "What did you do that for?" Walt asked. "I don't want Brian to come in here and start looking too closely at that thing." "Why? It's just a broom." "Exactly. And Brian saw me flying around on it." 3. Brian stood at the parlor window, gazing outside, his fingertips tucked lightly in the back pockets of his denim jeans. His thoughts weren't on the sights before him, but what he had seen just minutes earlier. He heard Walt and Danielle enter the room. It wasn't until Walt greeted him that he turned around and faced the couple. The memory of his first visit to Marlow House flashed in his mind. Back then, some 4 years earlier, he had been investigating the disappearance of Danielle's cousin and the missing Thorndyke. He had believed Danielle was involved in the disappearance. His opinion of her improved several months later, after she helped clear him of Darlene Gusarov's murder. Yet he still did not understand much of what had happened that day, or in many of the days that followed at Marlow House. "Danielle said you have a message from the chief," Walt said, breaking the silence, while gesturing to a chair for Brian to sit on. Brian's attention turned to Walt Marlow. He was truly an enigma, Brian thought. There were so many unanswered questions that his boss, Police Chief MacDonald, did not want to discuss. Marlow could have been the twin to his distant cousin, the original Walt Marlow, whose grandfather had founded Frederickport and built Marlow House. Since first meeting Danielle, Brian had believed she had an unhealthy fixation on the original Walt Marlow, a man who had been murdered on the premises over 90 years earlier. Brian always suspected that had played a role in her eventual marriage to the distant cousin. When Clint Marlow had arrived on the scene several years earlier and then was in an accident that claimed his fiancée along with his memory, he had stayed at Marlow House to recuperate after waking from his coma. From all accounts, and from what Brian had seen back then, Clint hadn't been a very pleasant man. But then he changed his name to Walt. Okay, maybe Walter Clint was his proper name, and he had been going by his middle name. But it all seemed so weird to Brian. What was stranger still was not just that Danielle had fallen in love with Walt, but those closest to her accepted the relationship. Even Chris Glandon, a.k.a. Chris Johnson, who had once dated Danielle, seemed supportive of the couple and had...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?